Welcome to CFTC Talks. I'm your host, Andy Bush, Chief Market Intelligence Officer for the CFTC. Hey, just a quick reminder, as always, there's a disclaimer at the end of the show that's important for you to listen to. You know, as we enter into the heart of summer and summer vacation for many of our listeners, I want to keep the drumbeat going on key problems and risks in the financial system so no one gets too comfortable at the beach or hiking or biking or doing whatever you do on your break. I'm sorry, there is just a lot going on in this world and we need to stay on top of it. So for this week, we're going to continue on a theme from last week's show on risks to the global financial system. Our guest today is Benn Steil, and he is a senior fellow and director of international economics for the Council on Foreign Relations and author of the new book, The Marshall Plan, Dawn of the Cold War. He is also the founding editor of International Finance, and this is a scholarly economics journal. He is also lead writer of the Council's Geographics economics blog and creator of a web-based interactive series tracking sovereign risk, global monetary policy, and central bank currency swaps. And for those of you who don't know, the Council on Foreign Relations is an independent, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, and publisher. They are dedicated to being a resource for its members, government officials, business executives, journalists, educators, and students, and civic and religious leaders, and other interested citizens in order to help them better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. Founded in 1921, CFR takes no institutional positions on matters of policy. I mean, basically, their goal is to start a conversation in this country about the need for Americans to better understand the world. And given all this backdrop and background, Ben, welcome to CFTC Talks.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
You bet. Hey, you cover a lot of territory in your research and thoughts, so it's really a treat to have you on today. So let's jump right into it. I'm going to ask you an easy question. Will there be a new market tantrum over the Federal Reserve raising interest rates?
That's a great question. Of course, we've already seen quite some turmoil in emerging markets. There are a lot of things driving that. But first and foremost, the fact that the Federal Reserve is really disconnecting from the path of monetary policy elsewhere. We're clearly in a tightening mode. We've been slowly winding down the Fed balance sheet, which is producing more of a monetary tightening than most people realize. And of course, emerging markets have been affected by that. Having said that, I think we're in somewhat better shape than we were in 2013. In
Right.
May of 2013, you remember Ben Bernanke made his famous taper comments. And we had an immediate rout in emerging markets. Now, today, of course, the Fed is taking much more asserted real action to tighten monetary policy. And given that, we should be somewhat comforted that the reaction hasn't been as bad as it could have been. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the emerging markets that were particularly hard hit in 2013,
Right.
These were countries that were running large current account deficits. And they were very dependent on capital inflows, which were being facilitated by the Fed's monthly asset purchases. Today, fast forward to today, if you look at those countries that were hardest hit in 2013, almost all of them have improved their current account position. There are some exceptions. Argentina is a big one. And of course, Argentina is right now in the eye of the storm.
Yeah, I think you bring up some interesting points. So let me kind of go back and fill in some blanks here for questions, because I think so much of this is really critical to the direction of the markets overall, and also some of the biggest risks that are out there. How do you view, and you brought this up about the Fed and quantitative tightening on their balance sheet, but how do you view the combination of raising interest rates, allowing the balance sheet to roll off, or quantitative tightening, and on top of that is the U.S. Treasury significantly increasing their issuance this year? How do you think that all swirls together?
Well, as you know, the Treasury and the Fed are not particularly well coordinated. Mostly, that's of course a policy reason.
Right.
But at times that can produce some confusion in the market. But of those three factors, the one that I would emphasize the most, because it's getting the least attention, is the Fed allowing the balance sheet to run off, because that actually is producing a monetary tightening that's far more significant than most commentators seem to realize.
Yeah, I think so too, and I've taken a look at that very seriously. I've talked to a number of different people on it, and I think that's what's, it's the music that's playing in the background for the financial markets that people are kind of getting used to. But you wonder if maybe that wasn't the best metaphor. Maybe it's the pot of boiling water that the frog is in, right?
That's a very nice analogy.
Yeah, I like that one. Oh, good. Well, there's also been a great deal of opinion and research pieces recently put out on the impact of Fed tightening on emerging markets, yours included. And I just want to point out and highlight, this also includes an op-ed by the governor of the Central Bank of India in the FT, and then that central bank went out and raised interest rates to somewhat back up their concerns. So, break this down for us. I mean, not all emerging market countries are the same, and obviously you detailed that a lot of them have greatly improved their current account balances. But India, Turkey, and Argentina, you mentioned Argentina already, but break some of those other countries down for me, starting with India and then maybe Turkey.
Well, in the case of India and Turkey, they've had mild improvements in their current account positions since 2013. And what that would suggest is that if they had been in the same position today that they were in 2013 in terms of their current account balance, they would be getting slammed probably quite considerably harder than they are right now. So despite the fact that, of course, the markets are concerned about developing country economic turmoil, it would be a lot worse if the current account situation hadn't improved as much as it has. And again, I would emphasize that the best evidence of this is Argentina, which has seen a deterioration of its current account and is now back in crisis, despite the fact that we have a market-friendly government in place.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it just stands in sharp contrast to the other countries. Even though Turkey and Brazil have been experiencing significant deteriorations in, I would say, in their financial markets, reflected by their interest rates going higher, especially on the long end. And I think in some of the research that you've written about, you talk about the problems within Turkey. I don't mean to continue to beat up on them, but just in that the difficulty there, because the government has really made a point of impinging upon central bank independence.
Absolutely. Yeah, so there's a tug of war going on in Turkey between the central bank and the government. And obviously, the markets don't like the uncertainty. When the sense in the markets is that the president is going to win out, and we're going to see relatively looser policy going forward, that's when you see the selling.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think that's something to keep in mind. Obviously, and I'm going to shift gears a little bit here with you, Ben, because that's fun to do with you since you cover such a large territory. But obviously, China has been in the news recently with the trade negotiations and between the U.S. and tariffs and so on. But I want to ask you about because you've written on this, and I think it's fascinating, about where we are with China's currency as the potential for a reserve currency. And you recently wrote a piece that said this has failed. Why?
Yeah. Well, I mean, since 2014, you've seen the end of the one-way bet in the markets on RMB appreciation. And I think what those who had been so bullish about the RMB as a global currency had been missing is that so much of the increase in international use of the RMB had been driven by speculative inflows because of the fact that the central bank was holding down the currency. So it was a safe currency to hold. You knew it couldn't go down; it could only go up. And so this was really speculative. And beginning in 2014, that began to unwind. And now you see China beginning to take some mild steps to try to boost international use of the RMB. Back in March, China launched its first oil futures contract denominated in RMB. And the idea there was that given that China is the world's largest oil importer, exporters, China hoped, would begin setting prices in RMB to track their new benchmark. Such a shift, China also hopes, would kickstart wider use of the currency and reduce global reliance on the U.S. dollar, in which, of course, the vast majority of oil trading is currently done.
Yeah, but and I think one of the points you make in the piece that you wrote was that it's not so easy to become a reserve currency, right?
Not at all.
And I think the problems with Italy kind of underscore that with the euro to some extent. It raises new questions about whether or not that's going to be an ongoing concern, which takes us back to 2011, 2012. But I think for China, I think this is one of the things they were trying to get at. And it's just not an easy thing to do. And the point that you make, I believe, one of the points you make in the piece that you wrote was that the reason why a lot of oil exporting countries like to have their oil priced in U.S. dollars is because of the certainty, right? That they can transact in it, that they can buy U.S. Treasury securities as a placeholder and hold it with the belief and the certainty that they will be able to get in and out of that currency and change it into other currencies. And that's not the case with China.
Yes, oil exporters especially rely on the U.S. Treasury markets to invest their profits safely. And this reliance, in turn, encourages many of them to peg their currencies to the dollar. So accepting non-dollar payment for oil increases their foreign exchange risk. So rather than act as a kickstarter, RMB oil futures really look to be a non-starter.
It's interesting. Well, when I'm thinking about China, I think about something that they're trying to do with their One Belt, One Road project. And I think that's an interesting, project overall, but it really gets me to think about the Marshall Plan. And it leads me into your book, which I've really enjoyed hearing about. And I want to start the questioning on your new book this way is, to some extent, this book is really an extension of your previous book on Bretton Woods. Now, why is that?
Well, that is a truly fascinating period between 1945 and 1949. The United States created all of the institutions that we associate today with what we call the liberal global order. The IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, NATO, the predecessor organizations to the European Union and the World Trade Organizations. All of these institutions were created in just these 4 short years after World War II.
That's amazing. Obviously, it's always good, and I think that's what's great about the work that you do. It's always great to contextualize what's happening today with going back to how did those structures begin in the first place, and why did they begin in the first place? So let's talk about the book, The Marshall Plan. And I guess my first question on this, which I loved about the book, was I think you make the case that this is the first really use of American soft power.
Right. Absolutely.
Break that down for our audience. Well, how did that come to be?
Right. Well, in May of 1945, when the fighting stopped in Europe, President Truman had been in office for all of a few weeks, and he had, at the time, no intention of overthrowing the foreign policy architecture that FDR had set up. And in particular, he was determined to fulfill FDR's commitment made at the Tehran Allied War Leaders Conference in 1943 to withdraw all American troops from Europe within 2 years of the end of the fighting. So Truman starts withdrawing American troops immediately. But by 1946, the military establishment in the United States realizes that that's going to create some big problems. Stalin is demonstrating that he's not happy with his newly expanded borders and the security buffer he had built for himself in Eastern Europe. He begins pressing territorial claims in Turkey and northern Iran. And so the military begins looking for ways to secure America's vital economic interests in Europe without having to rely on military force. And this is where the ideas that eventually evolved into the Marshall Plan came from. As you said, the first significant use of American soft power in the world.
That surprises me. I mean, who would have thought that people besides economists would have come up with an economic recovery plan, right?
Yeah, no, that's quite remarkable. As you and I know, Andy, the best policy ideas almost always come from economists.
Right.
But in this particular case, they actually emerged from the military establishment.
Right.
Once, of course, the plan started to be fleshed out, a Keynesian economist took it over.
Oh, no.
And steered the direction in which various components of the plan moved. But the general architecture had, in fact, been established by a combination of the Pentagon and the State Department.
So for our audience, put this in context. What was the cost of the Marshall Plan? How much did we actually put out there for Western Europe?
Right, $13.2 billion at the time, which today in current dollars would be about $135 billion. But that really doesn't give you a valid perspective on how large the commitment was. As a percentage of U.S. GDP at the time, if we were to launch a Marshall Plan today of equivalent size, we'd be talking about $800 billion.
Holy smokes.
And that doesn't even include all the military assistance we provided, which would push the figure up much closer to $1 trillion. So this was a very significant commitment, particularly given the fact that the U.S. in 1946 had entered into a quite deep recession driven by the collapse in government spending after the war.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but that's typically, I think, what happens after you go through war 1917, 1918. You get these big drop-offs of economic activity because you had such a huge government stimulus via the war spending. So I think that for me, that's, looking back on what happened, it's such a fascinating time right after World War II and all of the institutions that developed, and of course the Marshall Plan. I also think it's really funny that Truman didn't want to call it the Truman Plan, which they could have done.
Yes.
So why did
right.
he not want it to be called the Truman Plan?
Well, after Marshall's iconic speech at Harvard University in June of 1947, in which he foreshadows what would become the Marshall Plan, Truman's main political advisor, Clark Clifford, suggested to the president that it might be a good idea to call this thing the Truman Plan. But Truman was a very savvy political operator. He laughed and told Clifford that that was a non-starter, that anything bearing his name going up before a Republican Congress would, quote unquote, twitch a few times, go belly up, and die.
I love that. I love that.
Yes, but he said even the worst Republican, those were his words, the worst Republican could not vote against a plan named after the general.
Wow. Pretty politically savvy, obviously. Let me shift gears a little bit, because you make and have developed an interesting theory. I mean, the core of this book is in the title to some extent, but that the Marshall Plan created or laid the groundwork for the Cold War. What were the top 3 points that drove this theory for you?
Well, I should emphasize that I don't in any way suggest in the book that there would have been no Cold War.
Okay.
Had there not been a Marshall Plan.
Fair enough.
But the Marshall Plan was really the proximate cause. And what I mean by that is that it wasn't until Marshall's speech in June of 1947 that both sides in what became the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, reached the conclusion that they had to abandon the Yalta-Potsdam framework for cooperation and pursue their interest unilaterally. Marshall had come to that conclusion in April of 47 after 6 weeks of negotiation in Moscow over the future of occupied Germany with Foreign Minister Molotov and with Stalin himself. But in the case of Stalin, he was still convinced that cooperation, on his terms, of course, was still possible in Germany because he believed that Truman was going to have to withdraw the troops and eventually accept a unified Germany, which Moscow would be able to control in much the way that it had controlled Poland. And one of the surprising facts I found out in combing through the old Russian archives is that just a few weeks before Marshall's speech in June, Stalin had directed a Soviet negotiating delegation to reach agreement with the Americans on the creation of a unified interim government in Korea. And wow. He only abandoned that after Marshall's speech. Now, this is not to say that Stalin was truly in a globally cooperative mood. It just indicated that Stalin was willing to make trade-offs globally in order to get the ultimate prize, which was for him a unified communist Germany.
Fascinating. And it's interesting, too, because I think, couldn't the Soviets have participated in the Marshall Plan as well? I mean, they could have joined in, right? In
theory, yes. Marshall and his advisors, in particular George Kennan, were very concerned with what the public reaction would be globally if Marshall had excluded the Soviets and their satellite countries from the Marshall aid offer. Marshall, did not want the United States to be blamed for splitting Europe, effectively erecting the Iron Curtain that Churchill had discussed in 1946. So the idea was that the offer would be made open to the Soviet Union, but that the Soviets would be coaxed into rejecting it, so that Stalin would take blame for splitting Europe. And indeed, Stalin walked right into that trap.
Wow. Talk about a wonderful global chess game. And that is fantastic. You know, I think about this, and we hear today, even still, the use of the term the Marshall Plan, and perhaps using it in places like Syria. Just briefly walk us through, like, would that be a good idea, and how would it be different now versus back in the late 40s?
Yeah, the circumstances are entirely different in a war zone like Syria. You have to remember that Western Europe was reasonably secure at the time. Was not occupied by the Soviet Union, obviously. We already had functioning bureaucracies that were capable of implementing coherent economic programs in those states. And so just to give you an example of some contemporary states where that couldn't possibly work, consider Iraq and Afghanistan. We have already spent over $200 billion on reconstruction aid alone in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we have almost nothing to show for it politically or economically. Now, $200 billion is over 50% more than the totality of Marshall aid in current dollars.
Amazing.
And what is the reason? Of course, a lack of security. We have been unable to provide sufficient internal and external security to the Afghan and Iraqi regimes. In the case of the Marshall Plan, once we supplemented the economic aid with security aid in the form of NATO, which the United States created in 1949, we were able to provide the security context in which a coherent, well-funded economic reconstruction program could take effect.
That's fascinating. Well, we've been talking about the past. We're just in the present. So let's go to the future here and end this with, over the next 6 months, I'm fascinated by where your mind is. Where do you think, where do you think things are going as far as the global risks to the financial market system?
Yeah, well, number 1, 2, and 3 would be the U.S. tariffs and the prospect for a global trade war. We're certainly heading down that path right now. As you know, the Chinese have pledged to retaliate against the administration's newly announced tariffs. Just today, we learned that India was planning to retaliate. So we're headed in a direction that the markets almost certainly are not going to like. Now, up to this point, the markets have pretty much discounted the prospects for any serious global trade conflict. But nobody right now knows what President Trump's bottom line is here. Is this purely a negotiating tactic? And is some deal going to be reached at the 11th hour? Or are we going to go down the path of tariffs, retaliation to the retaliation, and that could do very significant damage to the global economy and, of course, the markets.
All right. Senior Fellow and Director of International Economics for the Council on Foreign Relations and author of The Marshall Plan, Dawn of the Cold War, Benn Steil, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
My pleasure. That's our show for this week. I hope I didn't disturb your summer vacation too much. Hey, remember, you can get access to all the shows we do here by either going on our website at cftc.gov or by getting out your phone, clicking on the podcast app and typing in CFTC Talks. Click subscribe if you want to get them every week. I'm Andy Bush, Chief Market Intelligence Officer for the CFTC. Thanks for listening. This has been CFTC Talks.